Hello, this is Sneakers Corner. Hope you're having a good day. Today I'm going to read to you a paper by Mark Durie called On the Origin of Qur'anic Arabic. It's a draft and it's dated 11th of November 2018, but it's a very interesting topic. I'm very curious about the exact process of how the Quran came to be, and one of the areas of interest is the actual language of the Arabic. So without further ado, I'll read the draft. It starts with the abstract. Previous research into the origins of the dialect of Arabic, which provided the standard for the Quranic consonantal text, has thrown up two puzzles, a puzzle from above and a puzzle from below. The puzzle from above is that the Muslim philologists who search earnestly for the Quranic dialect were unable to identify any of the dialects known to them as the source of Quranic Arabic. The puzzle from below is why, among the many thousands of pre-Quranic ancient Arabic inscriptions spread over a vast region, there are so few inscriptions which could reflect a precursor to Quranic Arabic. The solution to both puzzles, it is argued, is that Quranic Arabic, as reflected in its raceme or consonantal skeleton, developed directly from the Arabic of the Nabateans. The solution to the puzzle from below is that the Nabateans left many inscriptions, but in their preferred written language, Aramaic, not their mother tongue, Arabic. The solution to the puzzle from above is that the Muslim philologists were looking for a Bedouin source for the Quranic text, but Nabatean Arabic's linguistic legacy was to be found in dialects spoken by peasants in the southern Levant. Recent research by Al-Jalad has documented pre-conquest southern Levantine Arabic dialects in the Nabatean direct sphere of influence. These findings confirm the hypothesis that the Nabatean Arabic supplied the linguistic variety of the Quran. The puzzle from below, pre-Islamic evidence. For a millennium leading up to and including the 6th century CE, tens of thousands of inscriptions and graffiti in a variety of South Arabian scripts attest to the existence in the Arabian Peninsula of a variety of early Arabic dialects. A key question is, which of the attested ancient Arabian linguistic varieties, if any, was the precursor to Quranic Arabic? And if there was no written precursor, how was it that a dialect with no written history came to supply the Arabic of the Quran? A salient feature of the Quranic Arabic consonantal skeleton is the use of the definite article el. In contrast, most of the attested ancient early Arabic inscriptions, sometimes referred to as ancient North Arabian, are in varieties which use a variety of other definite articles, hn, h, or dash. I think that's a glottal stop. Only a few inscriptions use L. Evidence for the Al form appears very early. Herodotus, writing circa 440 BCE, almost a millennium before the Quran, reported that the deity of the Arabs was known as Alat, which must reflect Arabic Al-Ilat, the goddess. MCA MacDonald, 2009, C179, considered it to be a riddle of old Arabic studies that tens of thousands of inscriptions and graffiti are found over most of the Arabian Peninsula and beyond in a variety of scripts of dialects which rarely, if ever, use L. In contrast, the number of inscriptions using the L variety dialects is so tiny that MacDonald, 2008, 464, commented, "It is virtually certain that Arabic," here MacDonald means the precursor dialect to Qur'anic and Classical Arabic, "was a purely spoken rather than a habitually written language for most of its pre-Islamic history." He puzzled over the lack of inscriptions. "There seems to be no practical reason why Arabic should have remained an unwritten language for so long, particularly in areas which witness massive epigraphic activity in related dialects and other languages." MacDonald, 2009, D21. It is argued here that the answer to MacDonald's puzzle is that Nabatean Arabic, in which the L article had become standard, was the precursor to Quranic Arabic, and the Nabateans were so accustomed to writing in Aramaic that they used this script and language when they left graffiti behind them, rather than their spoken Arabic vernacular. It is consistent with this explanation that a significant majority of the Arabic inscriptions which do use L, except for Greco-Arabica, which is discussed below, are in the Nabatean script. There are only a small handful of inscriptions with L in South Arabian scripts. Nabateans and Nabati. Strabo described the Nabateans as the people whose capital was Petra, which was known as Rakhmu to the Nabateans. The terms Nabatayoi and Nabatea are borrowed from Arabic Nabati. This ancient title derives from the Arabic root NBT, which refers to water welling or oozing from the ground, and by extension to the extraction of groundwater by digging a well. Thus, Nabati originally meant well digger. Inscriptions have been found not only in Nabatean Aramaic, but also in early Arabic, in South Arabian scripts, in which people are identified as MBT, NBTY, or NBTW. It is not always clear whether this is intended as an ethnic or political designation, i.e. Nabatean, or a description of someone's mode of subsistence through agriculture. One inscription which must refer to the Nabatean kingdom is the Saphitic WGLSMN DMT SNT MT MLK NBT, which means, "And he halted on account of the downpour the year the king of Nabatea died." MacDonald has argued that Arabic existed, and indeed flourished, for centuries among the Nabateans of Petra in a stable diglossic environment in which first Aramaic and then Greek were used for formal written communications, while Arabic was the mother tongue of the community, with a vital oral tradition, including liturgical texts, a tradition which was not committed to writing. A variety of evidence supports this conclusion. Strabo referred to the Nabateans as Arabs, as did Diodorus Siculus. Josephus also called the Nabateans an Arabian nation, and Petra the Nabatean capital, the royal seat of the king of Arabia. Moreover, Josephus called the region to the south of Judea Arabia, which included the southern reaches of the Dead Sea where Petra was located. Trajan renamed Nabatea Provincia Arabia when he annexed it in 106 CE, and it was the custom of the Romans to name provinces after ethnicities. Moreover, it is clear from their Aramaic inscriptions that the Nabateans had Arabic names. Epiphanes, writing in the 4th century CE, refers to the Petraeans singing hymns in Arabic to their virgin goddess called Ka'abu, and MacDonald has suggested that 2 lines of Arabic poetry recorded in an inscription in the Negev attached to a text in Nabatean Aramaic was an excerpt from an oral liturgy in praise of the deified king god Obodas. This is evidence of the liturgical use of Arabic poetry in a Nabatean context. There are also known to be a large number of Arabic loanwords in Nabatean Aramaic, as well as evidence of Arabic syntactic influence on written Nabatean Aramaic, which is even stronger evidence than lexical borrowing for a substrate relationship between Arabic and Nabatean Aramaic. Furthermore, the place names in 6th century Petra, Papri, written in Greek, are predominantly Arabic, and there are also known to be a large number of Aramaic loans in classical Arabic. Further evidence that the Nabateans were Arabic speaking is the existence of a collection of legal papyri dating from the late 1st and early 2nd century CE, in which Jewish Aramaic documents include lists of Jewish Aramaic terms followed by Hebrew equivalents. In Nabatean Aramaic documents found alongside them, Aramaic terms are followed by their Arabic equivalents. It is hardly surprising that settled Arabs who needed to develop administrative infrastructure which demanded written text looked to Imperial Aramaic for a language of writing. However, all the evidence suggests that those who used the Nabatean script to write were mother tongue Arabic speakers. We should not assume that all those who wrote or commissioned a text in what we call the Nabatean language and script thought of themselves as ethnically or politically Nabatean, any more than someone who writes in the language we call English is necessarily English by nationality. What we also know is that Arabic orthography developed organically out of a cursive form of Nabatean Aramaic script, such as would be needed by traders for their account keeping on soft materials like papyrus. And there are some important early Arabic inscriptions in the Aramaic script. A pagan inscription from In Avdad and the Nabara inscription dated 328 CE. We conclude that an oral Nabatean Arabic substrate culture endured for centuries alongside Aramaic and then Greek literacy. Then speakers of Nabatean Arabic transitioned into using their Arabic mother tongue as their preferred medium of written communication, adapting the Nabatean Aramaic script for this purpose. We can tell this process was a gradual one from the way in which a fully developed Arabic handwritten script emerges into the light of day over centuries. MacDonald writes, "This means that we have to assume an extensive and possibly increasing use of writing on soft materials in the Nabatean script throughout the 4th to 7th centuries, since only this could produce the transitional letter forms and ligatures we see first in the Nabatean or transitional graffiti of the 5th century, then in the early Arabic inscriptions of the 6th and 7th centuries, and the early Arabic papyri of the mid-7th century. As gradual as this process was, it was presumably the necessity to administer in Arabic rather than Aramaic or Greek, which led to the emerging Nabatean Arabic script being used to record the texts of Arab-led government administration and of the religion of Islam. The puzzle from above. Evidence of Muslim philologists. In the discussion to this point, we have considered the emergence of Arabic in the light of pre-Qur'anic evidence, and particularly the comparative scarcity in inscriptions of evidence for a dialect precursor for Qur'anic Arabic. The suggested explanation is that the precursor to Qur'anic Arabic was the Arabic spoken by the Nabateans, and the reason Nabatean Arabic is not widely attested by inscriptions is that the Nabateans usually left written records in Aramaic rather than their mother tongue. We shall now consider the implication of the view from above, evidence from later post-Quranic Arabic sources, namely the inability of later investigators to locate the dialect in which the Quran was written. The literature devoted to the problem of the origin of Arabic on the basis of later Islamic sources was summarized by C. Rabin, 1955. Medieval Muslim philologists had devoted considerable efforts to studying and codifying Arabic, including seeking out evidence from Arabic dialects, and their evidence was carefully investigated by scholars in the first half of the 20th century. Muslim philologists took the language of the Quran as the Arabiya gold standard. At the same time, they also believed that Quranic Arabic was the same variety as the Arabic of pre-Islamic poetry. Early Muslim scholars drew upon this poetic corpus to help standardize classical Arabic, supplementing it with information drawn from speakers of Bedouin dialects whom they regarded as speakers of pure Arabic. Rabin commented wryly that the Bedouin could not speak wrong Arabic, even if he had wanted to. Pre-Quranic Arabic poetry was performed in court centres such as the Lakhmid court at Hira in Mesopotamia and the Ghaznid court of Jabiya in the Levant. We know also that poets came from a variety of different Arabic dialect areas, and their poetic idiom was standardized. For this reason, scholars have called the variety used by the poets a poetic koine. The medieval Muslim philologists naturally assumed that the language of the Quran was the dialect of Muhammad's tribe, the Quraysh. However, Rabin reported that by the 1940s, a consensus had developed among Western scholars that although the language of the Quran was accepted to have been based on the poetic koine, this could not have been the Meccan dialect. There is substantial agreement among European scholars that to most or all of those who employed it for writing poetry, classical Arabic was to some extent a foreign idiom which had to be acquired. This conclusion was based on a close examination of extensive reports in Muslim sources concerning Bedouin dialects. The discrepancies were well known to medieval Muslim scholars. For example, Ibn Abd-al-Barr had pointed out that certain linguistic features of the Quran, such as the preservation of the glottal stop, were inconsistent with Hijaz dialects. In response, Muslim philologists hypothesized that the Quran combined features of a wide variety of Bedouin dialects. For example, Suyuti commented that the Quran contains words from all Arabic dialects. Of course, this is precisely what one would expect to find if it was not composed in any of the Bedouin dialects. Rabin remarks that it is hard to understand that the scholars never seem to have realized that the spoken language of the Bedouin was different from the classical idiom. Two questions arise from these findings. One concerns the origin of the poetic koine, and another concerns the Quran's use of and relation to the koine. Rabin remarked that no progress seems to have been made in recent years in solving the problem of the place of origin of the poetic koine. This is the puzzle from above. The second question concerns Muhammad as the reciter of the Quran, and why he was addressing Meccans using the poetic koine of the Arab courts. Rabin put it this way: what reasons caused Muhammad to address his fellow townsmen in a language which originated and was at the time used for narrowly circumscribed purposes in Bedouin society, and that mainly in regions fairly remote from Mecca? Setting aside the question of whether the original setting of the Quran was Mecca, it is proposed here that the far-reaching Nabatean trading network, established for centuries, could have provided the context for an Arabic koine to be developed based on the Nabatean variety of Arabic. In the context of Arabic dialect diversity, and supported by the prestige of Nabatean power, it is proposed Nabatean Arabic supplied the precursor for poetic trans-regional standard to develop, which continued to be used by poets in far-flung Arab courts centuries after Nabatean power had waned. This koine was very similar to the Arabic variety used by the Qur'anic messenger for the recitations, which became the Quran. Because Nabatean Arabic was used by the traders who ranged far and wide across the Arabic-speaking region, the Qur'anic idiom would have been understood by speakers of a wide variety of dialects. It seems improbable that Bedouin Arabs would have considered the poetic koine a different language from their own native dialects. They would have simply recognized it as Arabic. This makes sense of the Quran's claim that the messenger was communicating bi lisani qawmihi, in the language of his people, Surah 14:4, using clear Mubin Arabic, Surah 16:103, Surah 26:194. It was clear because it was in a variety of Arabic understood by all, and not necessarily because it was necessarily in the local dialect of its first audience. It is an intriguing footnote to this discussion that the term Nabati came to refer to the indigenous oral performance poetry of the Bedouins, a usage which continues to this day. This use of Nabati perhaps owes its origins to a much earlier period when the poetic koine was identified as a Nabatean variety, and by metonymy, the linguistic variety in which poetry was performed lent its name to the poetic art itself. Imri reports that, in spite of linguistic differences, Nabati poetry and classical Arabic poetry share many prosodic thematic and functional similarities. The linguistic evidence. So far we have considered the puzzle from above and the puzzle from below, and suggested, based on circumstantial evidence, that the best candidate for a precursor dialect to the poetic Koine and the Arabic of the Quran was Nabatean Arabic, which would have been in use throughout the Nabatean trade networks. In this section we compare linguistic features of the Qur'anic Arabic and Nabatean Arabic. There are two kinds of linguistic evidence which link Qur'anic Arabic with the Nabatean variety. One is the very fact that the Arabic script developed from the Nabatean script. This implies that it was bilinguals who knew both Nabatean Aramaic and Arabic who established the orthographic conventions of Arabic. Another kind of evidence is the existence of specific shared linguistic features which link Nabatean Arabic with the Arabic of the Qur'anic Rasim, or unpointed consonantal skeleton. We have already noted that the use of the definite article al was a Nabatean feature. Early Arabic dialects, including epigraphic, Safitic, used a variety of forms of the definite article, including h, hn, and l, or they dispense with the article altogether. For example, his make. Although some earlier researchers had identified the L form as a distinctive feature of the precursor variety to Classical Arabic, Al-Jalad 2014 has argued that the L article is not an innovation that can be used to distinguish a separate genetic grouping within the Arabic varieties. Instead, Al-Jalad argues that all the diverse forms of the Old Arabic definite article were diffused across dialects. Nevertheless, although the L article may not be genetically significant as a diachronic marker, the frequency of its use is a distinguishing feature of Nabatean Arabic, where it is the only form of the definite article attested. On the other hand, in the Old Arabic dialects of the nomads, the L article was not standard. Al-Jalad 2014. So, in its frequency, the L article does link the language of the Quran to Nabatean Arabic, even if it is not a reliable genetic marker of a diachronic development within Old Arabic. There are other features which link the Quranic Rasim with the Greco-Arabica, Arabic written in Greek letters, of Arabia Petraea, the Nabatean heartland of the southern Levant. After they were conquered by the Romans in 106 CE, the Nabateans gradually shifted to using Greek as the language of formal written communications. There is a considerable number of subsequent Greco-Arabica inscriptions and papyri from the region of the Nabatean settlements in the southern Levant. And as Al-Jalad 2017 has observed, the linguistic features of these materials usually agree with the Arabic substratum of Nabatean against the ancient North Arabian epigraphy, particularly in the use of the definite article reflecting al and the feminine ending reflecting the a in contrast to at. The dialects of the southern Levant can broadly speaking be referred to as Nabatean. The analysis in this section is made possible by Al-Jalad's superb survey of Greco-Arabica of the southern Levant. Al-Jalad 2017 defines this area as comprising southern Syria, areas including the Lija, i.e. Trachonitis, al-Jamal, Basra, and the Horan, central and southern Jordan, including areas such as Moab, Edom, Petra, and the Hishma, and Israel, areas in the Negev such as Beersheba, Elusa, and Nasana. This region coincides with the area under Nabatean control before the Roman conquest of the Petra in 106 CE, which was renamed Araba Petraea after conquest, and administered from Bosra, the former northern Nabatean capital. Given the political stability of Araba Petraea after the 106 CE overthrow of the Nabatean kingdom and the continuing influence of Bosra, which had been a major Nabatean city, it is not surprising that Al-Jalad's 2017 study of Greco-Arabica across this region points to a consistency and uniformity in dialect features which aligns the Araba Petraea Greco-Arabica corpus with Nabatean Arabic. The 5 features we shall consider here are word final unstressed inflectional vowels, Irab, the feminine ending at or al, the feminine ending at or a, Aleph Maksura, retention of the glottal stop and the assimilation of the definite article al to following coronals or sun letters. The arguments presented here rely upon 2 assumptions. A. The spelling of the Qur'anic Rasim was phonemic at the time of the Arabic script became fixed, and B. The rhyme patterns in the Quran reflect the phonology of the dialect in which the Quran was first composed and recited. We shall see that in each of these respects the Quranic Rasim agrees with what we know of the Arabia Petraea Greco-Arabica, and where evidence is available, specifically with the Arabic or Petra. Al-Jalad has already acknowledged this, commenting that the Greco-Arabica of the southern Levant generally agrees with Quranic orthography. However, the arguments presented here are more thorough and also take into account evidence from Quranic rhyme schemes for Quranic phonology. Loss of case endings, Irab. In the Quranic script, unstressed, inflectional, short final vowels and nunation are marked with diacritics. They are not represented in the Rasim. These endings are known as Irab because they were characteristic of Bedouin Arab dialects, in contrast to settled urban dialects. Although classical pre-Quranic Arabic poetry incorporated Irab endings in its rhyme schemes, the Quran does not. This can be illustrated by Surah 1, the first surah, which has a rhyme scheme in im, but the inflectional endings added after the syllable and marked by diacritics vary between u, e and a. The indifference of Quranic rhyme schemes to case endings shows that the endings had been lost to the dialect in which the Quran was first recited. This agrees with what we know of Nabatean Arabic, which had lost case endings by the end of the 1st century BCE, as had southern Levantine Arabic by the 6th century CE. Al-Jalad 2017 summarizes the dialect evidence as, by the 6th century there can be no doubt as to the loss of case inflection, at least in Palestina, Tertia. The a ending and the ta marbuta. The Proto-Arabic and Proto-Semitic at feminine ending is rendered as h in the Quranic Rasim. In Nabatean Arabic, the feminine ending at had changed to a in posal non-construct position by the 2nd century BCE at the latest, Al-Jalad 2017, following a parallel change which had already taken place in Hebrew. Some Arabic loans into Nabatean predate this change, while others postdate it. Evidence for a terminum antiquem for this sound change is the Nabatean name Aretus, attested in 2 Maccabees 5:8, which reflects Arabic harata. A late 5th century CE example is cited by Avner, Nehme and Robin 2013 of the name to lib, found in a transitional Nabatean Arabic inscription. The change from at to a became a regional feature of southern Levantine Arabic. Al-Jalad concludes on the evidence of Greco-Roman inscriptions that by the 4th century CE this innovation had spread throughout the sedentary settlements of the southern Levant. In contrast, ancient North Arabian desert inscriptions do not show this change, retaining at in all positions. Thus, Al-Jalad 2017 describes the change to a as an isogloss, which separates sedentary Arabic varieties from the dialects written in rock inscriptions by the desert nomads of the Hara. In the Rasim of the Quran, the change from at to a is regularized to all positions, including non-construct context. However, the pronunciation of a is restored in non-posal positions to at by the addition of 2 superimposed dots, the pointing for T over the H to give ta marabouta. This implies that the change at to a had become regularized to all positions in the dialect, which originally determined the orthography of the Qur'anic Rasim. That this was not merely an orthographic convention, but the way the Quran was originally recited, is apparent from Qur'anic rhymes patterns in which the feminine singular ta marbuta endings rhyme indiscriminately with a regular H. Examples are Surah 80, 12-13, where Dakara hu, remember it, Rasim Dak KRH, rhymes with Mukaramat in, which means honoured, Rasim Im KRMH, and Surah 69, 18-19, where Kafiyat Un, which means secret, Rasim KH Aleph FYH, rhymes with Kitabaya, my book, Rasim KTBYH. Assuming that case endings and final unstressed vowels had already been lost, the first rhyming pair would have originally been recited as Dakara and Mukarama, and the second pair Kafiya and Kitabaya, with the rhyming syllables marked in bold. Quranic passages where ta marabouta rhymes with a regular H are Surah 69, 1-32, Surah 75, 1-6, 14-25, Surah 80, 11-24, 33-42, Surah 96, 15-18, Surah 98, 1-8, Surah 101, 1-11, and Surah 104, 1-9. On the other hand, ta marabouta never rhymes with regular ta. Surah 88 illustrates the contrast, keeping ta marabouta separate from ta. Surah 88, 8-16 rhymes consistently with ta marabouta, and then Surah 88, 17-20 switches to a consistent rhyme with a regular ta. The two rhyme scheme are kept separate, which indicates that regular ta was not the same phoneme as ta marabouta. The evidence of the rhymes indicate that at the time the Quran was first recited, so-called ta marabouta was actually pronounced as H in all positions, which is how it actually is written in the Rasim. Clearly, the dialect in which the Quran was originally recited had regularized this southern Levantine feature throughout the whole paradigm, including in non-posal positions. This regularization represents an advanced stage in the replacement of at with a, and as such it most likely to have taken place in the southern Levant, where the sound change was first attested in Nabatean Arabic. The change at a distinguishes Nabatean Arabic and the Arabic of the settlements, which came under the Nabatean sphere of influence, from the Arabic inscriptions of the Hara or the basalt desert nomads, which were trained at, and also from the Bedouin dialects, which later determined the standardized recitations of the Quran, in which the orthographic H of the Rasim was corrected back to T and distinguished orthographically by pointing as ta marbuta. Alif Maksura, word final A. Alif Maksura is the use in classical Arabic of word final dotless ya to represent a. For example, orthographic ly upon is pronounced as alay. This reflects the Proto-Arabic A. Al-Jalad 2017 has argued that Greco-Nabatean inscription supports an A pronunciation for reflexes of A in Nabatean Arabic. For example, in the inscription, the Nabatean deity Dushariz Du Share is written as in Greek, the dative of, I can't read Greek, and not of, and more Greek, so I can't read that. 80 years ago, Berg, Stasser and Pretzel, 1938, had already observed that recited A, written as Alif Maksura, does not rhyme with the A written with the Aleph in the Quran, and they came to the same conclusion as Al-Jalad, based on the Greco-Arabica evidence, namely that Alif Maksura reflects a distinct vowel, which they transcribed as A. For example, compare Surah 91 with a consistent Alif rhyme, and Surah 92 with a consistent Alif Maksura rhyme, and Surah 79, which has alternating but distinct passages of Alif rhyme, Surah 79 to 27 to 32, 42 to 46, and Alif Maksura rhyme, Surah 79, 15 to 26, 34 to 41, without any intermingling of the two rhymes. Al-Jalad 2017 observed that Greco-Arabica generally agrees with the Qur'anic orthography in its treatment of A. Here again, the evidence shows that the pronunciation of Qur'anic Arabic at the time of its initial recitation is consistent with Nabatean Arabic. Retention of the glottal stop. Whereas in the standardized recitation of the Quran, the glottal stop and the vowel of the definite article are elided and replaced by an ependicetic vowel, the Quranic Rasim retains the Aleph, indicating lack of elision. For example, the consonantal sequence BSM LH is recited as Bismillah. However, retention of the Aleph in the Rasim of the Quran indicates that A was not elided in the variety of Arabic on the basis of which the orthographic conventions of the Rasim were fixed. Similarly, the vocalic onset of the definite article is not elided in the Greco-Arabica of the southern Levant, even following vowels as shown. For example, and there's more Greek which I can't read. In this respect also the Quranic Rasims align with Nabatean Arabic. Unassimilated articles. Our final piece of evidence concerns the assimilation of the definite article al to a following coronal consonant. This has been indicated in Arabic orthography by the Shada diacritic. Here again, the lack of assimilation in the Qur'anic Rasim agrees with the evidence of Greco-Arabica and Nabatean inscriptions, and also with Semitic and Hispanic inscriptions. Al-Jalad 2017. There is papyri evidence from Petra as late as the 6th century CE of unassimilated al. For example, Edefa, a piece of Greek I can't read. This is our 5th piece of evidence linking the Arabic of the Quran to the Nabatean dialect. There is a possible distinction to be made between the Arabic dialect in which the orthographic conventions of the Rasim became fixed and the dialect in which the Quran was first recited. The two are not necessarily the same. It would hardly be surprising if the early spelling conventions of Arabic were based on Nabatean Arabic, since it is well established that Arabic orthography developed from the Nabatean Aramaic script. Indeed, in relation to each of the 5 features we have considered, the orthography of the Rasim is consistent with what we know of Nabatean Arabic. In addition, the first 3 features being reflected in Quranic rhyme schemes also point to Nabatean Arabic being the variety in which the Quran was first recited. In each of the linguistic features we have considered, the Rasim of the Quran aligns with Nabatean Arabic. This linguistic evidence confirms the circumstantial evidence of the puzzle from above and the puzzle from below, that the dialect in which the Quran was composed was Nabatean Arabic. A pure Bedouin tongue. There is a potential tension in idea of Arab identity and the origin of Quranic Arabic proposed here. On the one hand, we have argued that the Nabatean form of Arabic, which is associated with trade, agrarian settlement, and courtly culture, supplied the Arabic standard for the emerging Arab Empire and its religion, including the Arabiya, Surah 12:2, in which the Quran was written and spoken. On the other hand, the Bedouin nomads, or Arab, were held in high esteem as a prototype of Arab identity. In a sense, this tension is apparent in the Quran. On the one hand, the Quran takes pride in its language being clear Arabic, while on the other hand, it expresses a derogatory attitude to those who it calls Arab. These are the desert-dwelling Bedouin, in contrast to the settled people of the city, Surah 9:120, who constitute the Quranic messenger's primary audience. The sympathies of the messenger are with the city dwellers, and it seems consistent that the Arabic used in the Quranic Rasim was a settled and even urbanized standard variety, typical of Nabatean towns and villages, and not a Bedouin dialect. It is also understandable that the later Muslim scholars, many of them not Arabs, were romanced by the idea of a pure Bedouin Arab stereotype, reflected in the saying, Afsahu el-Arabi abaruhum. The best speakers of Arabic are those deepest in the desert. On this assumption, medieval Muslim scholars attempted to de-urbanize the origins of Quranic Arabic by sourcing it somewhere in the Arabian desert. This conflated 2 ideas: the doctrinal necessity that the Quran language was pure, and the stereotype that the language and culture of the Bedouins was pure. These joined into a single proposition that the Quran was composed in pure Bedouin tongue. This led Muslim scholars to devote considerable efforts to determine which Bedouin dialect or dialects could have provided the linguistic variety of the Quran. It apparently did not occur to them that this variety could be found among the settlements of southern Levant, which by the period of the Arab conquests had converted to Christianity. Implications for Quranic history. This account of the origin and emergence of Arabic has implications for the history of the Quran. When the Quran states that Allah only ever sends a messenger to speak in the language of his own people, Surah 14:4, This implies, given the consonantal skeleton is in Nabatean Arabic, that the Qur'anic messenger's own people were native speakers of the Nabatean Koine, and the title Mother of Towns of Surah 42:7 must have applied to an urban settlement in the Nabatean sphere of influence. It is hard to see how this could have been Mecca. On the other hand, if Muhammad had been debating with Meccan tribespeople in their own mother tongue, this would have been a Bedouin dialect and not a supra-regional Koine. In the light of the evidence linking Nabatean Arabic, the Quran, it seems scarcely credible that by the late 600s CE, Meccan Bedouin tribespeople would have spoken the clear Arabic language of the Quran as their mother tongue. Indeed, as we have seen, it was found by the medieval Muslim grammarians that the Meccan dialect diverged from the Quranic standard. Conclusion. The evidence put forward here suggests that the Arabic in which the Quran was recited and written was Nabatean. The Nabatean variety, it is suggested, would have been widely understood throughout the Arabic-speaking region because of Nabatean trade networks. It was not considered to be a different language from local Bedouin dialects, but a clear form of Arabic. A tradition of court poetry, probably based on the Nabatean variety, had already developed in the pre-Islamic period, no doubt influenced by the former Nabatean city of Bosra, which became the capital of Arabia Petraea. This explains why Muslim grammarians identify the poetic Koine as the same variety as Quranic Arabic. Later, in the process of standardizing the recitation of the Quran, other dialect features were overlaid upon the rasim of the Quran and marked by diacritics, including case endings and the consonantal assimilation of the definitive article, which were not features of the dialect in which the Quran was originally written. This model of the source of Quranic Arabic accounts for the evidence of pre-Islamic epigraphy, as well as the testimony of the Muslim philologists who standardized classical Arabic. It resolves the puzzle from below as well as the puzzle from above. It also accords with the linguistic evidence that Nabatean Arabic aligns with the linguistic variety attested in the rasim of the Quran. The solution to the puzzle from below is that epigraphic evidence of a precursor to classical Arabic appears so rarely in inscriptions because the Nabateans who spoke the precursor variety preferred to write it in Aramaic and for a time in Greek. The solution to the puzzle from above is it proved impossible for early Muslim philologists to locate the source dialect for Quranic Arabic among the various Bedouin tribes where they sought it, because Nabatean Arabic was not a Bedouin variety. In any case, Petra was no more, Nabatean identity had dissipated, and Nabatean Arabic was no longer this distinctive variety of any particular tribe, but had become the linguistic inheritance of peasants in the southern Levant, and in the poetic Koine, the common property of the Arabs. Thank you for listening.